Good evening, everyone. Hi, everybody. How you doing? It's good to see you. Thanks for joining me on another week of The Transcript with me, JT. We were going to continue on and possibly finish some of Sarah Boone. However, producer Tara came to me and said, "Hey, what do you think about doing the indictment for Sean Combs?" And I said, "Sure." This was just filed. It was just filed on September 12th, and it was recently unsealed. And so I've got a combination of the indictment and 3 other documents as well. And it's going to give us some insight into some pretty wild, painful things for some folks. So this is going to be a difficult episode. Hello to everybody who's tuning in. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to our wonderful, fantastic mods. This is going to be, let me put it this way. I'm putting this scroller up because it is involving a lot of stuff. And yes, you sure as heck will. I did because I like to read these for the first time with you. I didn't read all of it. I wanted to read enough of it so I could at least get an idea of the content. But it is some content. It's bad. So in the event that this isn't for you, that's totally fine. It's something that has happened that I think should be covered, if anything, so that people know just how shitty this person is, and many others who worked with him. Honestly, I don't remember all of R. Kelly, but it's along the same lines. I'll let somebody else who's already very familiar with these documents know, and we got an immediate yes. So we're going to go ahead and hop into this, and we are going to find out the answer to that question. All right. So this unsealed indictment is the U.S. District Court, Southern District of New York, United States of America v. Sean Combs, a.k.a. Puff Daddy, a.k.a. P. Diddy, a.k.a. Diddy, a.k.a. PD, a.k.a. Love. The first count is for a racketeering conspiracy. Now, I'm going to let you guys know, there's many times in here where it says Sean Combs, aka a billion different things. I'm going to leave it at Sean Combs and move on with the rest of the sentence, simply because that's his name. So, count 1, racketeering conspiracy. The grand jury charges. Overview. 1. For decades, Sean Combs, the defendant, abused, threatened, and coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. To do so, Combs relied on the employees, resources, and influence of the multifaceted business empire that he led and controlled, creating a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. 2. Sean Combs, the defendant, operated his business headquartered at various times in Manhattan and Los Angeles under a variety of United States-based corporate entities, including Bad Boy Entertainment, Combs Enterprises, and Combs Global, collectively the Combs Business. Corporate entities in the Combs Business included, among other things, the record labels, a recording studio, an apparel line, an alcoholic spirits business, a marketing agency, and a television network and media company. Number 3, at all times relevant to this indictment, Sean Combs, the defendant, engaged in a persistent and pervasive pattern of abuse towards women and other individuals. This abuse was, at times, verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual. As part of his pattern of abuse, Combs manipulated women to participate in highly orchestrated performances of sexual activity with male commercial sex workers. At times, Combs and others acting at his direction made arrangements for women and commercial sex workers to fly to Combs' location. Combs ensured participation from the women by, among other things, obtaining and distributing narcotics to them, controlling their careers, leveraging his financial support, and threatening to cut off the same, and using intimidation and violence. Number 4, physical abuse by Sean Combs, the defendant, was recurrent and widely known. On numerous occasions, from at least in or about 2009 and continuing for years, Combs assaulted women by, among other things, striking, punching, dragging, throwing objects at, and kicking them. These assaults were at times witnessed by others and included one instance at a Los Angeles hotel in or about March 2016, which was captured on video and later publicly reported, where Combs kicked, dragged, and threw a vase at a woman as she was attempting to leave. When a member of the hotel security staff intervened, Combs attempted to bribe the staff member to ensure silence. Combs' violence was also not limited to these women. It extended to his employees, witnesses to his abuse, and others. 5. Sean Combs, the defendant, used the Combs business, including certain employees, to carry out, facilitate, and cover up his abuse and commercial sex. Those employees, including security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and high-ranking supervisors, and other close associates, acted as Combs intermediaries, and their conduct was facilitated and assisted by Combs' control of the Combs business. The Combs enterprise. 6. From at least in or about 2008 through on or about the date of the filing of this indictment, Sean Combs, the defendant, and others known and unknown were members and associates of a criminal organization, the Combs Enterprise or the Enterprise. Members and associates of the Combs Enterprise engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other activities, sex, trafficking, forced labor, interstate transportation for purposes of prostitution, coercion, and enticement to engage in prostitution, narcotics offenses, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Number 7. The Combs Enterprise included its leadership, its members, and its associates. Constituted an enterprise as defined by Title 18 United States Code, Section 1961-4. That is a group of individuals associated in fact, although not a legal entity. The Combs Enterprise consisted of 1. Sean Combs, the defendant. 2. Entities within the Combs business, including but not limited to Bad Boy Entertainment, Combs Enterprises, and Combs Global. 3. Individuals employed by and associated with the Combs business. And 4. Others known and unknown. 8. The Combs Enterprise constituted an ongoing organization whose members functioned as a continuing unit for a common purpose of achieving the objectives of the Combs Enterprise. The Combs Enterprise was engaged in, and its activities affected, interstate and foreign commerce. The Combs Enterprise operated in the Southern District of New York and elsewhere. At all times relevant to this indictment, Sean Combs, the defendant, was the leader of the Combs Enterprise. 10. Sean Combs, the defendant, and others known and unknown, participated in unlawful and other activities related to the conduct of the Combs Enterprise's affairs. These individuals included certain Combs business employees, such as members of Combs security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and high-ranking supervisors, as well as other close associates of Combs. The purpose of the Combs Enterprise. 11. The purposes of the Combs Enterprise included the following. A. Operating a global business in the media, entertainment, and lifestyle industries, including, among other things, record labels, a recording studio, an apparel line, an alcoholic spirits business, a marketing agency, and a television network and media company. B. Preserving, protecting, promoting, and enhancing the power, reputation, and brand of Sean Combs, the defendant, as a musician, entrepreneur, and figure in the entertainment industry. C. enriching members and associates of the enterprise, including its leader, Combs, and in particular those who demonstrated loyalty to Combs and willingness to conceal his crimes. D. Preserving, protecting, promoting, and enhancing the power of the Combs enterprise, including the power of its leader, Combs, through violence, use of firearms, threats of violence, coercion, and verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. E. Fulfilling the personal desires of Combs, particularly those related to Combs' sexual gratification, including through the exploitation of women and the use of commercial sex workers. F. Enabling Combs and other members and associates of the Combs enterprise to engage in unlawful acts of violence, including sexual violence, sex trafficking, forced labor, interstate transportation for purposes of prostitution, coercion and enticement to engage in prostitution, narcotics distribution, and other crimes, and concealing the commission of such acts. G. Securing absolute loyalty from members of the Combs enterprise, including through acts of violence and threats. And H. Protecting the Combs enterprise and its members and associates, including Combs, from detection and prosecution by law enforcement authorities through acts of intimidation, manipulation, bribery, and threats of retaliation against individuals who witnessed the crimes committed by members and associates of the enterprise. Means and methods of the enterprise. 12. Among the means and methods by which Sean Combs, the defendant, and other members and associates of the Combs enterprise conducted and participated in the conduct of the affairs of the Combs enterprise included the following. And P.S., just to take a quick second, you'll notice that I'm reading right through this. I'm not making any comments. In the case of Sarah Boone, I feel a little more free to make comments. Here, one, I'm still learning along with you, so I don't feel that it's right to make comments on this. And two, this is intensely serious and not some letters to a judge. So, all right, included the following. A. Combs and other members and associates of the Combs enterprise wielded the power and prestige of Combs' role at the Combs business to intimidate, threaten, and lure female victims into Combs' orbit, often under the pretense of a romantic relationship. Combs then used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sex acts with male commercial sex workers that Combs referred to, among other things, freak-offs. Freak-offs were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, masturbated during, and often electronically recorded. In arranging these freak-offs, Combs, with the assistance of members and associates of the Combs enterprise, transported and caused to be transported commercial sex workers across state lines and internationally. Freak-offs occurred regularly, sometimes lasted multiple days, and often involved multiple commercial sex workers. During freak-offs, Combs distributed a variety of controlled substances to victims, in part to keep the victims obedient and compliant. Sometimes unbeknownst to the victims, Combs kept videos he filmed of victims engaging in sex acts with commercial sex workers. After freak-offs, Combs and the victims typically received IV fluids to recover from the physical exertion and drug use. B. Members and associates of the Combs enterprise, including high-ranking supervisors, security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and other Combs business employees, facilitated the freak-offs by, among other things, booking hotel rooms for the freak-offs, stocking the hotel room in advance with the required freak-off supplies, including controlled substances, baby oil, lubricant, extra linens, and lighting, cleaning the hotel rooms after the freak-offs to try to mitigate room damage, arranging for travel for victims, commercial sex workers, and Combs to and from the freak-offs, resupplying Combs with requested supplies, delivering large sums of cash to Combs to pay the commercial sex workers, and scheduling the delivery of IV fluids. In or about March 2024, during searches of Combs' residences in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California, law enforcement seized various freak-off supplies, including narcotics and more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant. C. Combs subjected victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse to cause the victims to engage in freak-offs. Combs maintained control over his victims through, among other things, physical violence, promises of career opportunities, granting and threatening to withhold financial support, and by other coercive means, including tracking their whereabouts, dictating the victim's appearance, monitoring their medical records, controlling their housing, and supplying them with controlled substances. During and separate from freak-offs, Combs, among other things, hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged victims at times by their hair. These assaults often resulted in injuries that took days or weeks to heal. Combs also threatened victims' careers and livelihoods, including if they resisted participating in freak-offs. Victims believed they could not refuse Combs' demands without risking their financial or job security or without repercussions in the form of physical or emotional abuse. Combs also used the sensitive, embarrassing, and incriminating recordings that he made during freak-offs as collateral to ensure the continued obedience and silence of the victims. This is gross. D. Members and associates of the Combs enterprise, including Combs' security personnel, at times carried firearms. On more than one occasion, Combs himself carried or brandished firearms to intimidate and threaten others, including victims of and witnesses to his abuse. In or about March 2024, during searches of Combs' residences in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California, law enforcement seized firearms and ammunition, including 3 AR-15s with defaced serial numbers, as well as a drum magazine. E. Members and associates of the Combs enterprise enabled Combs' control over victims by following his directions regarding financial payments to victims, advancing or suppressing the victim's career opportunities, and acquiring the controlled substances Combs used to keep the victims compliant. Members and associates of the Combs enterprise at times witnessed Combs' violence towards the victims or the victims' injuries caused by Combs without intervening. Instead, members and associates of the Combs enterprise helped conceal the violence and abuse by, among other things, assisting Combs in monitoring and preventing victims from leaving locations, such as hotels or Combs' residences. These occasions included instances in which a victim was required to remain in hiding, sometimes for several days at a time, to recover from injuries Combs inflicted without being publicly observed. Members and associates of the Combs enterprise also assisted Combs in locating and contacting victims who attempted to flee his abuse. F. When employees, witnesses to his abuse, or others threatened Combs' authority or reputation, Combs and members and associates of the enterprise engaged in acts of violence, threats of financial and reputational harm, and verbal abuse. These acts of violence included kidnapping and arson. In addition, on multiple occasions, Combs threw both objects and people, as well as hit, dragged, choked, and shoved others. G. When Combs' authority or reputation was threatened by the possibility of negative publicity or legal or law enforcement action against him, including in or about late 2023, following public allegations of Combs' crimes, Combs and members and associates of the enterprise pressured witnesses and victims, including through attempted bribery, to stay silent and not report what they experienced or knew to law enforcement. On phone calls, Combs and other members and associates of the enterprise, among other things, provided these victims and witnesses with a false narrative of events in an effort to conceal Combs' crimes. Combs caused these calls to be recorded on at least 2 occasions. The racketeering conspiracy. 13. From at least in or about 2008 through on or about the date of the filing of this indictment, in the Southern District of New York and elsewhere, Sean Combs, the defendant, and others known and unknown, being persons employed by and associated with the Combs enterprise, described in paragraphs 6 through 12 of this indictment, and enterprise engaged in and the activities of which affected interstate and foreign commerce, knowingly combined, conspired, confederated, and agreed together and with each other to violate the racketeering laws of the United States, to wit, Title 18, United States Code, Section 1962C. That is, to conduct and participate directly and indirectly in the conduct of the affairs of the Combs enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity, as that term is defined in Title 18 United States Code Sections 19611 and 19615, consisting of A. Multiple acts, including kidnapping, chargeable under the following provisions of state law: California Penal Code 207, kidnapping; Penal Code 21A, 664, attempt; Penal Code 31, aiding and abetting; Penal Code 182, conspiracy. B. Multiple acts, including involving arson, chargeable under the following provisions of state law: California Penal Code 451, arson; Penal Code 21A, 664, attempt; Penal Code 31, aiding and abetting; Penal Code 182, conspiracy. C. Multiple acts involving bribery, chargeable under the following provisions of state law. I am going to skip the penal codes, and we'll just get to the words here. D. Multiple acts indictable under Title 18 United States Code Section 1512 relating to tampering with a witness, victim, or an informant. E. Multiple acts indictable under Title 18 U.S. Code Sections 1589 and 2 relating to forced labor. F. Multiple acts indictable under Title 18 United States Code Sections 1591 and 2 relating to sex trafficking. G. Multiple acts indictable under Title 18 United States Code Sections 2421, 2422, and 2 relating to transportation and inducement to travel for purposes of prostitution and other illegal sexual activities. And H. Multiple offenses involving the possession with intent to distribute or distribution of narcotics and controlled substances, including cocaine, oxycodone, alprazolam, 3,4, methamphetamine. We're going to go with that. Methylenedioxymethamphetamine, 4-bromo-2,5-dimethoxyphenolthylamine, gamma hydroxybutyric acid, and ketamine in violation of Title 21 U.S. Code Sanctions 841 A1, B1C, B1E, B2, and 846, distribution and possession with intent to distribute and conspiracy to do the same. And Title 18, United States Code Sections 2, aiding, abetting, and willfully causing. 14. It was part of the conspiracy that Sean Combs, the defendant, agreed that a conspirator would commit at least 2 acts of racketeering activity in the conduct of the affairs of the Combs enterprise. Notice of special sentencing factor. From at least in or about 2009 up to and including in or about 2018 in the Southern District of New York and elsewhere, as part of his agreement to conduct and participate in a conduct of the affairs of the Combs enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity, Sean Combs, the defendant, agreed to, in and affecting interstate and foreign commerce, knowingly recruit, entice, harbor, transport, provide, obtain, advise, advertise, maintain, patronize, and solicit by any means a person knowing and in reckless disregard of the fact that means of force, threats of force, fraud, and coercion as described in Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1591 E2, and any combination of such means would be used to cause the person to engage in a commercial sex act in violation of Title 18 U.S. Code Section those numbers. That was count 1. It's okay. It's a grand total of 14 pages. We're on 11. Count 2. Sex trafficking by force, fraud, or you can't put those 2 words together. That's count 2. The grand jury further charges 16 from at least in or about 2009 up to and including in or about 2018 in the Southern District of New York and elsewhere, Sean Combs, the defendant, in and affecting interstate and foreign commerce, knowingly recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, provided, obtained, advertised, maintained, patronized, and solicited by any means a person, knowing and in reckless disregard of the fact that means of force, threats of force, fraud, and coercion, as described in Title 18 U.S. Code, and any combination of such means would be used to cause the person to engage in a commercial sex act and attempted, aided, and abetted, and willfully caused the same. To wit, Combs recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, and maintained a person known as Victim 1, and attempted, aided, and abetted, and willfully caused Victim 1 to engage in commercial sex acts, knowing and in reckless disregard of the fact that Victim 1 was engaging in commercial sex acts as a result of force, fraud, and coercion. Count 3, the grand jury further charges 17 from at least in or about 2009 up to and including in or about 2024 in the Southern District of New York and elsewhere, Sean Combs, the defendant, knowingly transported an individual in interstate and foreign commerce with intent that the individual engage in prostitution and attempted, aided, and abetted, and willfully caused the same. To wit, Combs transported, aided, and abetted, and willfully caused the transportation of female victims and commercial sex workers in interstate and foreign commerce on multiple occasions with the intent that they engage in prostitution. Forfeiture allegations. 18. As a result of committing the offense alleged in count 1 of this indictment, Sean Combs, the defendant, shall forfeit to the United States pursuant to Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1963 any and all interests the defendant acquired or maintained in violation of Title 18, any and all interest in, securities of, claims against, and property or contractual rights of any kind affording a source of influence over the enterprise named and described herein, which the defendant established, operated, controlled, conducted, and participated in the conduct of in violation of Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1962, and any and all property constituting and derived from proceeds obtained directly and indirectly said offense, including but not limited to a sum of money in the United States currency representing the amount of proceeds traceable to the commission of said offense. And you know that is the piece that hit him the hardest. How do you even figure that out? 19. As a result of committing the offense alleged in count 2 of this indictment, Sean Combs, the defendant, shall forfeit to the United States any and all property, real and personal, involved in, used, or intended to be used to commit or to facilitate the commission of said offense, and any and all property traceable to such property, any and all property, real and personal, constituting or derived from proceeds obtained directly or indirectly as a result of said offense, including but not limited to a sum of money in the United States currency representing the amount of property involved in said offense and proceeds traceable to the commission of said offense. As a result of committing the offense alleged in count 3 of this indictment, the defendant shall forfeit to the United States any and all property. That's the exact same paragraph. So count 3, he's supposed to, again, give up all property, real and personal, that constitutes or is derived from proceeds traceable to the commission of said offense, including but not limited to a sum of money in the United States currency representing the amount of proceeds traceable to the commission of said offense. Substitute assets provision. 21. If any of the above described forfeitable property as a result of any act or omission of the defendant, A, cannot be located upon the exercise of due diligence, B, has been transferred or sold to or deposited with a third person, C, has been placed beyond the jurisdiction of the court, D, has been substantially diminished in value, or E, has been commingled with other property which cannot be subdivided without difficulty, it is the intent of the United States, pursuant to Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1963M, Title 21 United States Code Section 853P, and Title 28 United States Code Section 2461C, to seek forfeiture of any other property of the defendant up to the value of the above forfeitable property. In other words, if they can't locate, if it's been transferred, if it's beyond the jurisdiction, all those things that were either directly or indirectly due to the counts above, or made off of the counts above. If any of those things are there, the United States is going to find what amounts to what that would have been and still take it away. So, signed Damian Williams, United States Attorney. Whew! That's just the beginning. I'm going to take 2 seconds, take a drink of water, and I'll be back with the next thing. But for now, watch this. All right. So the next document that we have here is to Judge Tarnofsky, the Honorable Robin F. Tarnofsky, U.S. Magistrate Judge in the Southern District of New York. And this is dated 1 day ago, September 17th, 2024, regarding United States v. Sean Combs. Dear Judge Tarnofsky, the defendant, Sean Combs, was taken into custody this morning after a grand jury sitting in this district returned a 3-count indictment charging him with crimes related to his decades-long pattern of physical and sexual violence against multiple victims, and his use of force, threats, and coercion to enact his will, protect his reputation, and fulfill his sexual desires. The government respectfully submits this letter in anticipation of the defendant's appearance before this court later today, and in support of the government's request for the defendant's detention pending trial. As set forth below, there is no condition or combination of conditions that will reasonably assure the appearance of the defendant as required, and the safety of others and the community, not to mention the integrity of the proceedings. As reflected by the gravity of the charges in the indictment, the defendant is dangerous and poses an ongoing threat to the safety of the community. If released, he remains a serious risk of flight, despite the conditions offered by his counsel. Most glaringly, the defendant also poses a significant risk of obstructing justice. Indeed, and as set forth below, during the course of the charged conduct, the defendant has attempted to bribe security staff and threatened and interfered with witnesses to his criminal conduct. He has already tried to obstruct the government's investigation of this case, repeatedly contacting victims and witnesses and feeding them false narratives of events, as described in detail below. There are simply no conditions that would ensure that the defendant's efforts to obstruct and tamper with witnesses will stop. The defendant, therefore, cannot overcome the statutory presumption in favor of detention, and the court should order him detained. Background. On September 17th, 2024, an indictment returned by a federal grand jury sitting in the Southern District of New York. The indictment was unsealed, charging the defendant with racketeering conspiracy from in or about 2008 through on or about the date of the indictment in violation of 18 U.S. Code 1962D, Count 1, sex trafficking from in or about 2009 through in or about 2018, and Count 2, and interstate transportation to engage in prostitution from in or about 2009 through in or about 2024. A. Combs' use of violence, threats, and coercion. Since at least 2008, The defendant and other members and associates of the racketeering enterprise alleged in the indictment, known as the enterprise, which includes the defendant's multifaceted business empire, the quote Combs business, wielded the power and prestige of the defendant's reputation as a musician, entrepreneur, and figure in the entertainment industry to commit federal crimes, including racketeering, sex trafficking, and other offenses. As charged in the indictment, many of those crimes involved the sexual abuse and exploitation of women and other crimes of violence. 1. Sex trafficking and abuse. Using the power and prestige of the enterprise, the defendant lured female victims into the defendant's orbit, often under the pretense of a romantic relationship. The defendant then used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause those female victims to engage in sexual activity, which included frequent sex acts with male commercial sex workers that the defendant referred to as, quote, freak-offs. Freak-offs were elaborate sex performances that the defendant arranged, directed, masturbated during, and often electronically recorded. Freak-offs occurred regularly from at least in or around 2009 through this year, sometimes lasted multiple days, and frequently involved multiple sex workers. The defendant arranged freak-offs with the assistance of members and associates of the enterprise, including employees of his business, and the hotel rooms where they were staged often sustained significant damages. The defendant ensured the victims would participate in freak-offs through coercion and violence. For instance, the defendant provided controlled substances, including ketamine, ecstasy, and gamma hydroxybutyrate, I might be saying that wrong, also known as GHB, to female victims so that they could and would continue to engage in freak-offs despite fatigue, physical and emotional exhaustion, and pain. Additionally, both during freak-offs and separate from freak-offs, the defendant subjected female victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse, in part to cause them to engage in freak-offs. Sorry. The defendant hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged female victims, sometimes by their hair. At least a dozen witnesses will confirm that they personally observed the defendant's violence towards women and or the injuries sustained by women at the defendant's hand. One incident of physical abuse occurred when a female victim was attempting to leave the hotel following a March 2016 freak-off. This abuse was captured on video surveillance and publicly reported in May 2024. The defendant's assaults often resulted in serious injuries to the victims that took days or weeks to heal. Just to give you an example of the significant damages, approximately 2012 in Manhattan, the defendant paid over $46,000 to cover damages to a penthouse hotel room following one of these. The defendant also coerced victims into participating in freak-offs by controlling their careers, finances, livelihood, and or housing, among other aspects of their lives, or by threatening to disseminate recordings of freak-offs. The defendant used his considerable wealth and influence to make victims rely on him financially, for example, by paying for their rent or their cars, or by offering them career opportunities. Once he provided his support, the defendant repeatedly threatened to take it away to ensure the victim's compliance with his demands, including their participation in freak-offs. Indeed, victims believed that they could not refuse the defendant's demands that they engage in freak-offs without risking their financial security or career prospects, or without repercussions in the form of physical or emotional abuse. 2. Other violence. In addition to the defendant's physical, sexual, and emotional abuse of his romantic partners, the defendant repeatedly engaged in acts of violence directed towards his employees and others. As charged in the indictment, the defendant, often assisted by members and associates of the enterprise, engaged in kidnapping, arson, and physical violence, such as throwing objects at people, throwing people to the ground, and hitting, dragging, choking, and shoving others. Numerous witnesses, including the defendant's employees and others, observed or experienced violence from the defendant firsthand and sustained lasting trauma as a result. For example, in the early morning hours of December 22nd, 2011, the defendant and a co-conspirator kidnapped an individual at gunpoint to facilitate breaking into and entering the residence of another, known as Individual 1. Multiple witnesses would testify at trial to the events surrounding the kidnapping and break-in, the latter of which is corroborated by police reports and other records. Approximately 2 weeks later, the defendant's co-conspirators set fire to Individual 1's vehicle by slicing open the car's convertible top and dropping a Molotov cocktail inside the interior. Police and fire department reports extensively document the arson and conclude that the fire was intentionally set. Multiple witnesses would also testify to the defendant bragging about his role in destroying Individual 1's car. More broadly, since at least 2008, allegations of the defendant's physical abuse of women and others have been publicly reported in the media, including in Hollywood blogs and on podcasts. Law enforcement reports corroborate that police responded to several instances of the defendant's violence, including assaults against victims and other individuals. More recently, there has been an outpouring of other public allegations against the defendant, including claims of threats and physical and sexual violence, dating as far back as the 1990s. In short, the defendant's violent tendencies are widely known. However, at no point during the past few decades has the threat of public exposure or law enforcement intervention deterred the defendant from continuing his abuse. 3. Firearms. The defendant and members of the enterprise, including the defendant's security personnel, at times carried firearms, and the defendant himself carried and brandished firearms to intimidate and threaten others. Indeed, some victims were aware of the defendant's access to firearms. On one occasion, the defendant forced a female victim to carry a firearm on his behalf, and on another occasion, he pointed a firearm at a female victim. The defendant continues to have access to guns, including illegal firearms. In March 2024, during searches of the defendant's residences in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California, law enforcement seized firearms and ammunition, including 3 AR-15s, each with defaced serial numbers, as well as a large capacity drum magazine. As pictured below in a close-up image, the serial number of one of the AR-15s is visibly bored through and obscured. 2 of the 3 defaced AR-15s were found in the defendant's Miami bedroom closet, stored broken down in parts, along with magazines that were loaded with ammunition, as depicted below. One of the AR-15s had a 10-round magazine loaded with 10 rounds of large caliber .223 ammunition, while the second AR-15 had a 30-round magazine loaded with 90 rounds of .223 ammunition. Jeez Louise. A large capacity drum magazine loaded with 59 rounds of .223 ammunition was seized from the defendant's Los Angeles residence as depicted below. That looks insane. You know what? I hope they test these. I hope they test these guns, and I hope they run them against crimes wherever. In addition, 6 legally purchased guns with serial numbers, some of which were stored in gun safes, were recovered from the defendant's residences. Although these particular guns, both the legal and illegal firearms, were seized, their presence in the defendant's home demonstrates that the defendant has access to and surrounds himself with both guns and ammunition. Likewise, even if the defendant were personally restrained by the court from obtaining new firearms himself, he could retain access to them through others. Looking at footnote 4, Certain of the firearms seized during the March 2024 searches were licensed to a current member of Combs' security staff. In addition to that individual, during the course of the charged conspiracy, Combs has employed other security staff members with significant criminal history, including violent crimes and firearms offenses. In sum, the defendant's regular use of violence and threats of violence, as well as the coercion described above against the victims and others, fostered a culture of fear in which these individuals believed they were unable to reject the defendant's demands without subjecting themselves to physical violence or other abuse. B. Combs bribed witnesses and obstructed justice. I said that like Batman. Justice. Throughout the time period charged in the indictment, when the defendant faced the possibility that his violent and criminal conduct could become public, the defendant and other members and associates of the enterprise pressured witnesses and victims not to report what they saw or heard to law enforcement, or to otherwise conceal the criminal conduct. For example, and as noted above, in March 2016, the defendant was captured on video surveillance striking, kicking, and dragging a woman in a public area of a hotel in an apparent attempt to prevent her from leaving a freak-off. When a member of hotel security staff intervened, the defendant attempted to offer the hotel security officer a stack of cash to ensure his silence. After the security guard refused the defendant's bribe, and after coordination between the defendant and his employees, the defendant's staff contacted other members of hotel security. At the same time, staff members were in close communication with the victim of the assault as well, all in an effort to cover up the defendant's assault and to prevent the incident from being publicly disclosed. Within days of the incident, the surveillance video disappeared from the hotel's server. Similarly, throughout the time period charged in the indictment, members and associates of the enterprise have reached out to multiple victims on behalf of the defendant to convince them not to report the defendant's abuse. Most recently, in late 2023, immediately following public allegations of certain of the defendant's crimes, including his physical and sexual abuse of women, the defendant and other members of the enterprise made repeated phone calls to victims and witnesses during which they provided victims and witnesses a false narrative of events in an apparent effort to conceal the defendant's crimes. On at least 2 occasions, the defendant recorded those calls on a co-conspirator's cell phone, thereby attempting to obscure his involvement in the obstruction. C. The government's investigation is ongoing. While the indictment against the defendant was unsealed today, the investigation into his and other co-conspirators' conduct is active and ongoing. As a result of that ongoing investigation, as well as the defendant's charged conduct outlined above, including obstruction of justice and witness tampering, the government is limited in its ability to fully set forth all known details of the defendant's criminal conduct, including details of certain witness testimony. To the extent the court has additional questions about the charged offense conduct or any other information set forth herein, the government is prepared to proffer additional information on an ex parte basis. Argument. Again, I am going to read the words. Y'all can go back. 1. Applicable law. Under the Bail Reform Act, federal courts are empowered to order a defendant's detention pending trial upon a determination that the defendant is either a danger to the community or a risk of flight. A finding of risk of flight must be supported by a preponderance of the evidence. A finding of dangerousness must be supported by clear and convincing evidence. Obstruction of justice is another ground for pretrial detention by the courts. Courts in the Second Circuit have held that pretrial detention for obstruction of justice is appropriate as long as the government can establish by clear and convincing evidence that there exists a serious risk the defendant would threaten, injure, or intimidate a prospective witness or juror. The Bail Reform Act lists 4 factors to be considered in the detention analysis. 1. The nature and circumstances of the crimes charged, including whether the offense is a violation of Section 1591. 2. The weight of the evidence against the person. 3. The history and characteristics of the defendant, including the person's character, past conduct, and financial resources. And 4. The nature and seriousness of the danger to any person or the community that would be posed by the person's release. The concept of dangerousness encompasses not only the effect of a defendant's release on the safety of identifiable individuals such as victims and witnesses, but also, quote, the danger that the defendant might engage in criminal activity to the detriment of the community. A finding of dangerousness does not require that the defendant have a criminal history, particularly if a defendant has a history of domestic violence. Evidentiary rules do not apply at detention hearings, and the government is entitled to present evidence by way of proffer, among other means. Where a judicial officer concludes after a hearing that, quote, no condition or combination of conditions will reasonably assure the appearance of the person as required and the safety of any other person and the community, such judicial officer shall order the detention of the person before trial. Additionally, where, as here, a defendant is charged with sex trafficking in violation of 18 U.S. Code 1951, in other words, an offense under Chapter 77 of Title 18, it shall be presumed subject to rebuttal that no condition or combination of conditions will reasonably assure the appearance of the defendant as required and the safety of the community. 2. Discussion. For the reasons set forth, this is like, I feel like any lawyer or any attorney, whatever, is like, now I can let it go. For the reasons set forth below, the defendant poses a significant danger to the community, both in terms of physical violence and obstructive conduct, as well as a risk of flight. This is especially true given the nature of the criminal conduct and the strong weight of the evidence. The defendant, therefore, cannot overcome the statutory presumption in favor of detention in this case. A. Dangerousness. The defendant is charged with serious and violent crimes. As charged in the indictment, the defendant has physically and sexually abused women and others for the better part of 2 decades. The sex trafficking charge, based on the defendant's abusive conduct, count 2, carries with it a presumption of detention. And detention is particularly supported by the facts of this case. Since at least 2008, the defendant has engaged in serious acts of violence, including forcing and coercing women to participate in sexual activity, including sex acts with commercial sex workers, by using physical force, financial pressure, emotional abuse, and narcotics. These acts described in detail above were referred to as freak-offs, among other names, and involved orchestrated sexual performances facilitated through drug use that sometimes lasted days at a time. That is not all. As set forth in the indictment, the charges against the defendant capture significant additional violence, both spontaneous and premeditated. On numerous occasions, the defendant assaulted women, employees, and others when he became enraged by throwing objects at them, choking them, pushing them, kicking them, and slamming them against walls and onto the ground. The defendant and other members and associates of the enterprise were also capable of premeditated violence, resorting to kidnapping and arson when the defendant's power and control were threatened. The defendant's violence, whether spontaneous or premeditated, had the effect of exerting his continued control over these individuals. The defendant also carried firearms to intimidate and threaten others. Multiple defaced semi-automatic rifles were recovered when law enforcement searched the defendant's residences in March of 2024, including 2 defaced rifles that had been disassembled and hidden in the defendant's bedroom closet. In short, the conduct with which the defendant is charged shows a pattern of violent and abusive conduct, underscoring his dangerousness. Having those 3 AR-15s taken apart, hidden in a closet, tells me that they were there for the purposes of putting together when needed, or they were used and they were taken apart to make it difficult to find. That's quite the presumption on my part, but that's how I'm feeling about it. That's how I feel about it now. This disposition of violence cannot be reasonably prevented through bail conditions. The violence alleged in the indictment was not isolated or aberrational. It was systematic and pervasive. The defendant abused women with whom he was in personal relationships, employees, witnesses to his crimes, and others, as described above. The defendant has sexually, physically, and emotionally abused long-term romantic partners for decades, including by forcing them to engage in freak-offs. The defendant has abused countless others in his orbit, and in particular women, without regard for consequences. Indeed, the defendant's abuse of women long predates the conduct charged in this indictment. To date, at least 5 women have publicly accused the defendant of violent sexual assaults dating back to the 1990s. Moreover, the defendant's violence and abuse often occurred behind closed doors, including in his homes, hotels where he was staying, and other private settings. He has assaulted victims, employees, and others, and even brandished a firearm at a victim in his homes. The alleged sex trafficking similarly took place in private settings, not easily monitored. Indeed, in addition to engaging in freak-offs at hotels, the defendant has at times organized freak-offs at his home or at the homes of his female victims. This is precisely the kind of violence that even strict conditions such as home incarceration cannot prevent. In sum, the defendant's long history of violent conduct makes clear that even the most stringent bail conditions will not suffice to ensure the safety of the community. The defendant is a serial abuser who repeatedly assaults and coerces women to achieve his own sexual gratification and uses his vast wealth and position of power in the entertainment industry to conceal his illegal conduct and prevent victims of and witnesses to his abuse from coming forward. The defendant's long-standing pattern of abuse is probative evidence of the likelihood that he will continue to abuse. Indeed, nothing, not even the threat of public exposure or law enforcement intervention, has stopped his abuse. The defendant has continued to physically assault and threaten those around him, including his romantic partners, his employees, and others who happen to be present when he succumbed to fits of rage. No bail conditions can address the defendant's tendency to become violent when angry or emotional. Anyone in his presence is at risk of abuse or assault. And the defendant's physical assaults are serious, resulting at times in serious injury requiring medical intervention and long periods of recovery. Therefore, the, quote, nature and seriousness of the danger to any person is both real and specific. B. Obstruction. As part of the charged racketeering conspiracy, the defendant engaged in obstruction of justice, including bribery and witness tampering. Given the defendant's history of engaging in obstructive conduct to conceal his criminal activity, both personally and through intermediaries, there is every reason to believe that the defendant will continue to engage in such obstruction if released. As detailed in the indictment, following a freak-off in March 2016, the defendant attempted to bribe hotel security staff to prevent hotel security from publicly disclosing and or reporting to law enforcement his vicious attack on a woman attempting to leave a freak-off. The defendant's efforts to disclaim responsibility for that attack continued until earlier this year. A civil lawsuit was filed on or about November 16, 2023, alleging years of sexual, emotional, verbal, and physical abuse by the defendant, including allegations describing the March 2016 incident. Following the filing of the lawsuit, the defendant stated in no uncertain terms, did I read that? Hold on. Yeah. Quote, "Let me be absolutely clear. I did not do any of the awful things being alleged." Through counsel, the defendant, quote, vehemently denied these offensive and outrageous allegations, describing the complaint as, quote, riddled with baseless and outrageous lies. It was not until the video surveillance footage of the defendant's attack was leaked to the media months later that the defendant was forced to admit that he had, in fact, perpetrated the disgusting attack. Clearly, the defendant is willing to deflect, minimize, and lie, and induce others to do so on his behalf to avoid taking responsibility for his own actions. More recently, the defendant has, directly and through intermediaries, engaged in obstructive conduct related to the matters under investigation in this case. Specifically, following the November 2023 lawsuit, the defendant and intermediaries acting on his behalf reached out to potential victims and witnesses to the alleged conduct, including individuals he did not speak to regularly and had not spoken to in years, to attempt to feed those victims and witnesses false narratives about the defendant's criminal conduct. With respect to at least two of these individuals, the defendant's co-conspirators assisted in efforts to protect the defendant. For example, on or about November 19th, 2023, just 3 days after the filing of the lawsuit described above, the defendant made multiple calls to another victim of his sexual abuse and recorded certain of those calls using the cell phone of a co-conspirator. During the calls, the defendant repeatedly asked for the victim's support and friendship and attempted to convince the victim that she had willingly engaged in acts constituting sexual abuse. The defendant also assured the victim that if she, quote, needed the defendant too, she ain't got worry about nothing else. A thinly veiled attempt to coerce the victim into adopting and supporting the defendant's false version of events to protect the defendant. Even more concerning, since learning about the criminal investigation, including following the execution of the search warrants at his residences, Combs contacted other witnesses on multiple occasions, including other witnesses who had received grand jury subpoenas. The defendant's recent conduct is similar to that in United States v. LaFontaine, in which the Second Circuit affirmed the district court's revocation of pretrial release after the defendant in that case engaged in witness tampering. Specifically, the defendant, who was charged with multiple counts of fraud in connection with providing false claims to medical insurers, called a witness to, quote, remind the witness that a particular patient had received surgeries that the patient had not, in fact, received. The Second Circuit affirmed the district court's finding that there was no condition or combination of conditions that would assure the safety of the community given the defendant's witness tampering, despite the fact that the defendant's tampering did not include actual violence or threats of violence. Rejecting the defendant's arguments that the district court's finding of dangerousness was not justifiable, the Second Circuit noted that the defendant had, quote, fed the witness false testimony with the expectation that the witness would adopt it, and that even stringent electronic monitoring conditions could be circumvented. Here, the defendant's conduct goes beyond what the LaFontaine court found sufficient to revoke bail. Even before being charged with a crime, the defendant has taken numerous proactive steps to tamper with potential witnesses' testimony against him. The government is aware, through electronic evidence, toll records, conversations with witnesses, and other evidence, that the defendant has contacted witnesses, including subpoenaed witnesses, prior to the dates on which the witnesses were required to appear before the grand jury. In addition, the defendant has recorded calls with at least one victim and provided, either directly or through intermediaries, false narratives of the events that transpired so that those witnesses would adopt that false testimony. Moreover, the defendant's obstructive conduct is made even more alarming by the manner in which he carried it out to evade detection, in some instances by having intermediaries make calls on his behalf and recording certain calls on other individuals' device. These deliberate actions show that the defendant was aware that what he was doing was obstructive and that his aim was to evade detection. Even the most stringent conditions, including the monitoring of a court-authorized electronic device, would fail to ensure that the defendant would not engage in this kind of obstruction from his home, including by acting through intermediaries and using others' devices. Given the defendant's history of obstruction, as well as the violent nature of the charges against the defendant cannot overcome the presumption that no condition or combination of conditions can assure the safety of the community. C, risk of flight. Nor can the defendant overcome the presumption that he is a risk of flight. The crimes that the defendant is charged with carry significant penalties, including a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years imprisonment and a statutory maximum sentence of life imprisonment. The possibility of a substantial sentence is a significant factor in assessing the risk of flight. Here, the defendant is facing at least 15 years imprisonment if he is convicted. This fact alone would provide a compelling incentive for anyone to flee from prosecution. But the incentive to flee is especially strong for this defendant who, at age 54, faces the very real prospect of spending a substantial portion of the rest of his life in prison. As detailed below, the evidence in this case is incredibly powerful, as the facts set forth in the indictment and herein make plain. Dozens of victims and witnesses have provided detailed, credible, and corroborated information against the defendant. These individuals include many who personally experienced and witnessed violence and other crimes at the hand of the defendant. Moreover, their accounts are well corroborated by significant extrinsic evidence, including financial and billing records, travel records, electronic data, and communications, including extensive communications by and with the defendant himself. For example, victim testimony regarding freak-offs is at times corroborated by other witnesses' testimony, communications with the defendant and commercial sex workers, travel records, hotel records, videos of the freak-offs, and records reflecting or indicating payment. Similarly, a victim's physical abuse may be corroborated by, among other things, videos of the abuse, photographs of the injuries, reports made to law enforcement, communications with the defendant and others, and testimony from other witnesses who saw or heard about the abuse. The vast and varied sources of evidence described in detail below will be compelling evidence of guilt at any trial in this case. Thus, the serious risk of conviction provides further incentive for the defendant to free prosecution. Moreover, in the case, risk of flight is augmented by the nature of the evidence against the defendant. The evidence against the defendant, which would be made public at trial, includes substantial evidence that is highly sensitive and has the potential to significantly and negatively impact the defendant's reputation. For example, dozens of video recordings created by the defendant of freak-offs with victims. For decades, the defendant has spent significant time and resources ensuring that his criminal conduct avoids public scrutiny. Given the potential penalties here, both incarceration and reputational harm, the defendant has every incentive to flee to avoid prosecution and public trial. The defendant's incentive to flee, outlined above, coupled with the defendant's seemingly limitless resources, creates significant risk of non-appearance. Indeed, the investigation of this case has revealed that the defendant has access to vast funds. The defendant's net worth is publicly estimated at being close to $1 billion. Indeed, the investigation of this case has revealed that the defendant has access to vast funds and resources, including deep reserves of cash, which would facilitate his evasion of prosecution. At least as of December 2023, the defendant had access to dozens of bank accounts, some personal and many other under corporate entities, which contain millions of dollars. Additionally, as of December 2023, the defendant had over $1 million in personal cash on hand. What? The defendant has traveled internationally several times per year since at least 2006, and since approximately 2019 has owned a personal plane on which he has traveled internationally. The the footnote 10 says, through conversations with the defense counsel, the government understands that defense counsel is currently in possession of the defendant's passport, as well as the passports of several of the defendant's family members, and that the defendant is in the process of attempting to sell his plane and Los Angeles residence. As explained above, however, the defendant's vast resources make him a flight risk even without a passport, private plane, or multiple residences. Hear, hear. The defendant maintains two primary residences in Los Angeles and Miami. In addition to his private plane, the defendant owns multiple vehicles in multiple locations. He has a personal staff, including assistants, security, chefs, trainers, and others who perform tasks at his command, including transporting him, delivering him currency, securing narcotics for him, and other tasks. And he is extraordinarily well connected both within and outside the entertainment industry. In short, if the defendant wanted to flee, he has the money, manpower, and tools to do so quickly and without detection. The defendant's lack of access to his passport or private jet would not negate the fact that the defendant could easily buy his way out of facing justice. As discussed below, the defendant's legal team has attempted to mitigate this substantial risk of flight by taking steps such as taking his family's passports, attempting to sell his plane, and reporting his whereabouts to the government. These steps have been taken with the precise goal of crafting an argument for bail before the court. While the defendant may have made the calculated decision in consultation with his attorneys not to flee before any charges were filed, that calculus inevitably changes today, when an indictment charging the defendant with extremely serious offenses carrying enormous potential penalties was unsealed. He is now, for the first time in his life, facing a mandatory minimum term of imprisonment of 15 years and a maximum term of imprisonment of life, in which the government is prepared to prove the charges against him by, among other things, the testimony of dozens of witnesses and victims to his serial abuse, and evidence from dozens of his own electronic devices and those of his co-conspirators. Given the serious nature of the charges, the strength of the evidence, and the defendant's access to vast amounts of resources, his risk of flight is more pronounced today than it has ever been. Weight of the evidence. In considering the danger and risk of flight presented by the defendant, the court is also required to consider the weight of the evidence against the defendant. The defendant faces a strong and powerful case here, only magnifying the danger he could present to others, especially victims and witnesses ready to testify against him, and the risk he flees. The evidence, physical evidence, and subpoena returns and other voluntary productions, among other things. As to witnesses to date, the government has conducted interviews with over 50 victims and witnesses, many of whom saw or experienced the defendant's abuse. Many of the witnesses corroborate one another, and their accounts are similarly consistent with the other types of evidence discussed below. The government only expects that number to continue to grow, given that the investigation, which is now public, is ongoing. The electronic evidence is similarly vast. The government has sought and obtained numerous search warrants for such evidence, in addition to obtaining evidence voluntarily from certain victims and witnesses. Setting aside devices seized in connection with the defendant's arrest, the government has obtained over 90 cell phones, laptops, and cloud storage accounts, as well as over 30 other electronic and storage devices such as hard drives, thumb drives, cameras, and a surveillance system. This electronic data comes from the defendant himself, as well as co-conspirators, victims, and witnesses, and chronicles much of the defendant's criminal activity as it occurs. The evidence also consists of physical evidence, which was seized pursuant to search warrants executed at the defendant's residence in Los Angeles and Miami, as well as on his person and the persons of certain co-conspirators. In addition to the firearms and electronics discussed above, the physical evidence also includes other evidence of freak-offs, including over 1,000 bottles of baby oil and personal lubricant. Finally, the evidence includes records obtained pursuant to over 300 grand jury subpoenas and other voluntary productions. These materials come from over 100 entities and individuals, including communications providers, tech companies, social media companies, banks and other financial institutions, airlines, hotels, car services, and other travel-related companies, escort services, and even the defendant's companies and wealth management firm. Together, this evidence, as well as other evidence gathered, powerfully demonstrates the defendant's guilt and counsels in favor of detention. The defendant's proposed bail package is insufficient. In other words, his bail game is weak. For all the reasons set forth herein, there is no bail package that can reasonably assure the safety of others in this case, where the defendant has engaged in decades-long pattern of violence against women and others, and has used his wealth and power to ensure that his criminal conduct goes unpunished through manipulative and obstructive conduct. In particular, the bail package proposed by defense counsel is insufficient because it fails to adequately protect others from the defendant's violence, impose measures to prevent and detect obstruction, or prevent the defendant from accessing his vast resources, including millions of dollars in cash, to evade prosecution or dissipating those assets to avoid financial penalties for his crimes. The defense counsel has proposed certain bail conditions, including home detention with electronic monitoring and a $50 million bond secured by the defendant's Miami property. These conditions are plainly insufficient to address the legitimate concerns set out above. In particular, given the defendant's history of engaging in obstructive conduct, the court must reject the insufficient conditions proposed by the defense counsel, which do nothing to prevent and detect such conduct. For example, in U.S. v. Ferranti, a case in which the defendant was charged with witness tampering and where obstruction remained an ongoing concern, the Second Circuit reversed the district court's release of the defendant on bail conditions because the $1 million bond, obstruction remained an ongoing concern, release of the defendant on bail conditions because the $1 million bond, which was to be secured by properties owned by the defendant and members of his family, only deterred flight, not danger. More specifically, the Second Circuit found the district court's bail condition intended to address witness tampering, which was a general prohibition that the defendant was not to commit a crime or intimidate a witness. Notably, the defendant's previously proposed conditions do not include provisions related to his access to electronic devices, which, as outlined above, the defendant uses to engage in obstructive conduct. Nor do the proposed conditions include information related to or restrictions on access to the defendant's vast resources, including multiple personal bank accounts in the name of the defendant's business, and deep cash reserves, which could facilitate the defendant's flight. Similarly, the proposed conditions fail to protect against dissipation of assets, which may be subject to forfeiture or penalties on the charge of the indictment. Finally, the proposed conditions do not include conditions that would limit the defendant's potential to engage in violence or abuse, such as drug testing and treatment and surrender of all firearms. Conclusion. As set forth above, the defendant poses an ongoing and significant danger to the community, has repeatedly engaged in obstructive conduct, and presents a serious risk of flight. The government respectfully submits that the defendant cannot meet his burden of overcoming the statutory presumption in favor of detention. There are no conditions of bail that would assure the appearance and compliance of the defendant or the safety of others. Accordingly, any application for bail should be denied. Respectfully submitted, Damian Williams, U.S. Attorney. Was it today or yesterday they denied his bail? Because I'm pretty sure the judge did indeed deny bail. I do not have this exhibit. All right. Of course that loaded weird. Thanks, defense. All right. Is that the name of... Okay. Agnifilo Intrader? Sure did yesterday. Cool. Good. Bail denied. All right, so this is from the defense. Dear Judge Tarnofsky, Mr. Sean Combs, through his counsel, submits this letter to the court for release on certain specified conditions. Yesterday evening, Mr. Combs was arrested on an indictment charging him with the following offenses. For the reasons set forth below, we ask this court to release Mr. Combs pursuant to our proposed bail package. This letter will walk the court through a series of actions taken by Mr. Combs over the past 6 months that prove that he is not a risk of flight or a danger to anyone in the community. These actions prove that Mr. Combs is eminently trustworthy, that he is All right, I might make fun of this letter. This is ridiculous. Eminently trustworthy. Somebody shift F7 to this. Eminently trustworthy that he is demonstrably committed to showing his innocence in court in the context of this case, and that he should be released on the conditions proposed in order to do so. Somebody who thinks they have the upper hand. The first thing the court should know is that when it became apparent to his counsel that Mr. Combs would at some point soon be formally charged, he did something extraordinary. He left his home in Miami and traveled to New York, the very location of the prosecutors and agents investigating him. Through counsel, Mr. Combs promptly told the government that he had voluntarily come to New York, offered to tell them specifically where he was, and offered to turn himself in at the appropriate time. Even though Mr. Combs came to New York, authorized his lawyers to tell the government of his location, and offered to self-surrender, the government effected an arrest last evening. This, we know, is the government's right. However, that he traveled to New York to self-surrender is also something the court should consider. You get a slow clap. This was not the first action Mr. Combs took to show his trustworthiness and lack of... You know what he did, right, sir? The evidence been proffered to you, correct, sir? Doesn't matter. His trustworthiness and lack of flight risk. Indeed, it is part of a pattern since even before the March 25th, 2024 searches on Mr. Combs' residences, Mr. Combs and his counsel have been fully aware that the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York has been conducting an investigation involving allegations concerning racketeering and sex trafficking and other offenses. Knowing for these many months that he would be indicted, Mr. Combs has done everything, as will be set out below, to work with the prosecutors in ways that are unusual, if not unprecedented. Yes, nobody ever before in the history of U.S. justice has worked with prosecutors in the way that your client has. I'm sure. I'm with you, Amy. So many cursey words. Oh, here we go. In light of these circumstances, he can rebut the presumption of detention here due to his extraordinary, I want to say extraordinary actions in this investigation. Mr. Combs should be released on the conditions proposed so that he can fight this case in court effectively. Here we go. Get ready. The proposed package. The defense proposes the following bail package. A $50 million bond. B, co-signed by Sean Combs, his mother, his sister, the mother of his oldest daughter, and his 3 adult sons. B, co-signed by Sean Combs, his mother... I just did that. I was so frustrated. C, secured by the equity in Mr. Combs' residence located at 2 West Star Island in Miami, Florida. Hold on. 2 West Star Island, Miami, Florida. You wanna show me? It's worth 40. It's worth what? It's worth $41.4 million. Good grief. The rent estimate is $212,489. Fun times. Oh, wait, it says it here. I don't know why I looked that up. The appraised value of the home is about $48 million. B, the home is unencumbered. In anticipation of this bail hearing on August 20th, 2024, Mr. Combs paid off the remaining mortgage of about $18 million so that the home could be used to secure a bond and be free of a mortgage. D, secured by the equity of Mr. Combs' mother's home located at 450 Alton Road in Miami, Florida. I won't look that one up because it's probably bad enough I said it out loud. Mr. Combs' travel will be restricted to the Southern District of Florida and the Southern District of New York to attend court, meet with his counsel, and attend medical appointments, which we will address to the court in a separate sealed submission, as well as the Eastern District of New York or the District of New Jersey, only to the extent that his travel to and from New York involves an airport in those districts. Mr. Combs' passport was surrendered to his counsel on April 1st, 2024. April Fools. His counsel advised the prosecutors of this fact in an email dated the same day. Counsel will provide this passport to pretrial services. G. The passports of the following family members who have already surrendered their passports to counsel after the raids on Mr. Combs' home. A. Janice Combs. B. Chance Combs. C. Jesse Combs. C. Delilah Combs. And E. Love Combs. H. Since at least April 2024, Mr. Combs has been making efforts to sell his airplane. We informed the government of these efforts in May 2024, as explained further below. Just this weekend, Mr. Combs entered into a letter of intent with a party to sell it. Mr. Combs understands he is not to travel to Los Angeles, where the plane had been located this week, and further, that the plane is not to be brought to any district in which he is located until it is sold. I. Home detention with GPS monitoring, and J. All other standard conditions of pretrial supervision. In bold, the history of this investigation shows a great degree of collaboration between the government, Mr. Combs, and his counsel, which should weigh heavily on this court releasing him on the conditions proposed. First off, run-on sentence. Second off, why are you capitalizing it and centering it? On March 13th, 2024, counsel for Mr. Combs emailed the assigned assistant United States attorneys. In this introductory email, counsel identified himself as counsel for Mr. Combs and stated that he wished to speak with the prosecutors and share information about Mr. Combs and the matters under investigation. After not hearing back from the AUSAs, counsel again emailed the prosecutors on March 18th, 2024. Counsel did not get a response to the second email either. On March, this is starting to sound like a Sarah Boone letter. On March 25th, 2024, search warrants were executed at Mr. Combs' places of residence in Miami and Los Angeles. In addition, he was removed from his airplane and searched. 100%. Absolutely. Poor Puffy. He was removed from his airplane. The searches of the residences were unusually public and particularly heavy-handed. The agents had assault rifles trained on the heads and the chests of his children, who were then handcuffed and brought before news cameras and a press helicopter. On the day of the searches, counsel called the prosecutors and they spoke for the first time. Counsel indicated that he would accept service of 2 grand jury subpoenas to Mr. Combs' businesses. 1. Counsel took possession of Mr. Combs' passport on April Fool's Day. About a week following the searches, on April 1st, 2024, counsel took possession of Mr. Combs' U.S. passport. As noted on this same day, counsel advised the AUSAs of the fact that counsel had Mr. Combs' passport, that we would not return it to him, and that he would not leave the country during the pendency of the investigation. We have, in fact, maintained the passports, and Mr. Combs has not, in fact, left the country, despite knowing the investigation was ongoing, despite having a plane at his disposal, despite not being charged with any crime. Counsel agreed to advise the government of all domestic travel. Moreover, counsel advised the government that if Mr. Combs intended to travel domestically, counsel would so inform the AUSAs. These 2 promises have also been kept. For example, on June 9th, 2024, counsel advised the AUSAs that Mr. Combs was traveling from Miami to Los Angeles to go on a road trip with his children. What a dad. In addition, we provided the AUSAs with information about when his flight departed and it would land. On June 29th, 2024, counsel emailed the prosecutors that Mr. Combs was flying to Wyoming via a chartered aircraft. On July 5th, 2024, counsel emailed the prosecutors that he was traveling back to Los Angeles. 2 days later, on July 7th, 2024, when he traveled back to Miami via a chartered aircraft, we again emailed the AUSAs. In addition, when Mr. Combs planned travel but not take those trips, we notified the prosecutors of that as well. All right. Advised the government of Mr. Combs' efforts to sell his airplane. On May 21st, 2024, counsel advised the AUSAs during a phone call that Mr. Combs had commenced efforts to sell his airplane. We followed up on that conversation the next day, on May 22nd, 2024, with a letter to the AUSAs that efforts were underway to sell the aircraft and reminding the AUSAs that counsel continued to be in possession of his passport. Over the past several months, there have been several potential buyers for the airplane, and at least 2 buyers have signed a letter of intent to purchase the aircraft. Just this weekend, a buyer for the aircraft and representatives for Mr. Combs executed a letter of intent. Due to the nature of this asset and the amount of inspection and due diligence that is required for a purchase, it is not a simple asset to offload. Throw a Molotov cocktail in it like you did that other person's car. That'll offload it pretty fast. In advance of the plane being sold, which it eventually will be, we have agreed to keep the airplane in Los Angeles while Mr. Combs resides in his home in Florida if it is not being chartered. Coincidentally, and not at Mr. Combs' request, last night the airplane was chartered on a Part 135 flight from Los Angeles to Teterboro, New Jersey. Mr. Combs had no advance knowledge of the flight, nor did he possess any control over its movements last night. Obviously, Mr. Combs agrees to not go to any state, in this case New Jersey, in which his airplane is located pending its sale, which is actively being pursued. Here's the thing, like, what do you mean does he not possess control? That was literally his thing. He controlled everything and everyone. He always has control. He has it now. 4, Mr. Combs voluntarily relocated to New York in advance of his arrest. Yay. Once it became apparent to counsel that Mr. Combs' arrest was imminent, he promptly relocated to New York City. On September 5th, 2024, Mr. Combs arrived in New York, and counsel immediately informed the government of Mr. Combs' whereabouts. Counsel offered to continually share Mr. Combs' location with the government. Since arriving in New York on September 5th, Mr. Combs has been staying at the Park Hyatt, New York. Due to bookings made at the Park Hyatt prior to Mr. Combs' reservation, after today, September 17th, 2024, he would no longer be able to stay at the Park Hyatt. Accordingly, Mr. Combs had a reservation to stay at the Carlisle Hotel starting today. By all means, let's see how much the price of a room is at the Carlisle. Shall we? Between $1,000 to $1,600 a night at the Carlisle. And then he was where at? The Park Hyatt, New York? That one is 700, 500 to 700 probably. Fuck this guy. Since Mr. Combs relocated to New York City earlier this month, counsel has been looking for a 1-month rental for he ain't gonna need that no more. Mr. Combs in New York City. Despite counsel's persistence, it has been challenging to find a rental for many reasons, including because of the numerous events occurring in New York City in September. For instance, the US Open, Fashion Week, and the UN Summit. And some landlords' discomfort with having Mr. Combs as a tenant, given the investigation. Last night, now hold on a second. Hold on. That stuff wasn't unsealed until whatever. You know what? Whatever. Last night, counsel had scheduled a viewing of a potential apartment. However, because of Mr. Combs' arrest, counsel and Mr. Combs obviously were not able to view the rental. You're welcome. 5, counsel advised the government that it was in possession of the passports of members of the Combs family. We know that already. 6, counsel's assistance to the government concerning the subpoenas. As stated above, counsel accepted service of the 2 subpoenas directed at several of Combs' businesses in March of 2024. Separate counsel for the entities filed a motion to quash those subpoenas in April of 2024. In May of 2024, upon becoming sole counsel in connection with the criminal investigation of Mr. Combs, we advised the court that it would withdraw the motion to quash the grand jury subpoenas and instead that the parties would meet and confer with the government to minimize the number of requests on which the parties disagreed. Counsel agreed to begin gathering documents responsive to the subpoena. For the past several months, counsel for Mr. Combs and the AUSAs have had regular discussions about what documents we had, what we did not have, and in regard to the documents we did not have, where the government may be able to find them. We did this for two reasons. First, there was nothing, in counsel's estimation, that would constitute evidence of Mr. Combs being involved in any federal crime. Second, we wanted to be appropriately helpful to the government in its investigation. To that end, the Combs entities have produced over 144,000 pages of documents to the SDNY in compliance with the subpoena. Wow. 6. Paying off the mortgage, the two West Star Island in Miami. As noted in the discussion about the bail package, on August 20th, 2024, Mr. Combs caused the outstanding mortgage to be paid on his primary residence in Miami. This payment of about $18 million was for one reason alone, so that he would have this $48 million residence free and clear of any encumbrances, so that it can be used to secure a bond. We submit this is a truly extraordinary measure that shows resoundingly that Mr. Combs is appropriately focused on defending this case on the merits in this court. Legal standard. He talks about the legal standard. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that we can get through all of this tonight. Ugh. Yeah, also, I just don't feel like reading their stupid arguments about this stuff. Now, here could be interesting. The defendant's history and characteristics. Huh. How could you write this seriously? Mr. Combs' history and characteristics are best demonstrated by the way he has responded to this investigation from the very inception to his most recent decision to travel to New York when his lawyers told him that the case could soon be starting. You guys know the test where, or like a survey, where they ask you a question and then another one that's kind of similar and you give the same answer just because you thought it sounded right? This is the same situation here. They can only go back like a day or two to give an example of his characteristics because to go back further is folly. He has never run from a challenge, and he will not run from this one. Instead, he takes these challenges head on. There's a difference between trying to get a Grammy and trying to beat a 15-year to life imprisonment case. He moves towards them confidently and with the assurance that right is on his side. These are not merely the words of his lawyer. Rather, the actions of Mr. Combs over the last several months conclusively prove this. Aside from his actions since the inception of the investigation, Mr. Combs' character is shown through his demonstrated contributions to society in several important areas. Nope. First, he has given generously over his entire life to charitable causes. To name only a few examples, since founding Bad Boy Entertainment in 1993, Mr. Combs has actively supported and donated millions to after-school programs and organizations like the Boys and Girls Clubs of America. Gross. His commitment stems from the positive influence such programs had on his own childhood, obviously not good enough, inspiring him to give back to similar initiatives. He has also supported organizations including the National Foundation for Teaching Entrepreneurship, NFTE, further emphasizing his dedication to creating opportunities for young entrepreneurs. A cornerstone of his philanthropy is education. And he fulfilled a lifelong dream when he, with a partner, opened Capital Preparatory Harlem Capital Charter School in 2016. That should probably be looked into, to provide high-quality education to inner-city youth in New York City. The success of this initiative led to the launch of Capital Preparatory Bronx Charter School in 2020, with Combs donating $1 million to support its development. These schools are part of his broader commitment to education, which includes significant contributions to historically black colleges and universities, such as $2 million to Howard and $1 million to Jackson State in 2023. Mr. Combs, you realize what I read earlier in the prosecution's letter stated that he had $1 million in cash on hand. So the fact to me And yes, it's a chunk of money, obviously. I will never see it in my lifetime. But the fact to me that he has donated $1 million here, $2 million here, he literally could open a suitcase and just hand it to people without a problem. It's just not enough. Mr. Combs has also been proactive in health and disaster relief efforts, having raised over $2 million for New York City public schools and hosting a virtual dance-a-thon that raised more than $4 million to provide personal protective equipment to healthcare workers on the front line of the COVID-19 pandemic. Cool. I mean, that's good. But again, he's hosting something where other people give money. Particularly important, and he could have just cut a check for that stuff. Particularly important in an election year is Mr. Combs' contribution to mobilizing young voters with the Vote or Die slogan through Citizen Change, which he founded to significantly increase political awareness and youth voter turnout. I mean, these are good things, but what? Second, few people have done more to advance the cause of black people in the music, entertainment, and fashion industries than has Sean Combs. That is quite a statement. Well, he has always been Prince, for one. While he has always been controversial, he has also championed minorities and underrepresented communities. I can't really speak much to this. I don't know. As chairman of Combs Global, Mr. Combs has used his platform to create the Excellence Program, an internship initiative with Endeavor in July 2021, a major initiative designed to provide development opportunities for aspiring executives in entertainment, marketing, music, and fashion from underrepresented communities. That's a long sentence. Mr. Combs' philanthropic work has earned him numerous accolades throughout his career, which will all be taken away, including the Triumph Award from the National Action Network in 2016, the Superhero Award from Room to Read in 2017, the Child of America Award from the Carver Foundation in 2018, and in 2023, the Icon Award from the Apollo. Through his multifaceted career, Mr. Combs has not only created thousands of jobs, including valuable internships for young professionals, but has also supported minority and women-owned businesses. You did not just say that. Leveraging them as key suppliers and vendors for his enterprise. You did not just... All poor word choices. Suppliers and vendors, women-owned businesses. In the words of Hook, bad form, Peter. Bad form. Counsel will be prepared to address the factors of dangerousness to the community and weight of the evidence in court at the 2:30 p.m. initial appearance. In other words, we didn't have time. The proposed bail package addresses any issues with flight and danger to community. In light of the proposed conditions, the actions Mr. Combs has already taken regarding the investigation, and Mr. Combs' lifetime commitment to live up to his obligations concerning every challenge he has ever faced, he should be released to fight this case in court and prove his innocence. Sean Combs has never evaded, avoided, eluded, or run from a challenge in his life, except for, the 20-plus year cover-up. He will not start now. As he has handled every hardship, he will meet this case head on. He will work hard to defend himself, and he will prevail. Recognizing that a bail hearing is not the time to defend the merits of a criminal case, it is relevant to bail that the defendant has made a clear commitment to defend an eminently defensible case. This is such a case. Finally, several courts in this district have recognized that the conditions at Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn are not fit for pretrial detention. Just earlier this summer, an inmate was murdered. I mean, that sucks, but at least 4 inmates have died by suicide there in the past 3 years. Numerous courts in this district have raised concerns with the horrific conditions of detention there. Conditions at MDC are described as dreadful and long-standing, and noting that the issues with food contamination and hazardous physical conditions were an ongoing tragedy. Infested with bugs, plagued by violence, described overcrowding, staffing issues, and lockdowns, describing MDC conditions as disgusting and inhuman as anything I've heard about any Colombian prison, but more so because we're supposed to be better than that. Courts in the Eastern District of New York have shared the same concerns. Conclusion. For the reasons set forth above, we move this court to release Combs under the conditions set forth above. Whoa! Way to be redundantly redundant. For the reasons set forth above, we move this court to release Combs under the conditions set forth above. It's not really redundant. It's a terribly formed sentence. Thank you for your consideration. Respectfully submitted, Mark Agnifilo and Terry R. Garagos. Counsel. Yep. What was this called? What's this prison called? The Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. Images. I'm just looking real quick here. I mean, it looks like prison to me. Inside Brooklyn's House of Detention jail. Here, let's take a brief look, shall we? And then we will do the last thing. They really could have. A cell inside the shuttered Brooklyn detention complex was left in a state of disrepair. Inside Brooklyn's infamous House of Detention. Is this it? Slated for the Wrecking Ball? That's not it. I'm looking for the Metropolitan. I mean, it's just multiple floors. It's just... Oh, okay, hold on. Bankman-Fried's bail. Bankman-Fried, the guy who, like, with FTX, he was confined in Metropolitan. Oh, how sad. Here, look. Here you go. I'll just show you this one. No, I don't want that. Look at... Oh, boo-hoo. 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 I wonder if there's anything else here. Nope, that's it. That's enough. I mean, that's good enough to know. All right, so we got one more tonight. Let me see. This one might have to get broken into pieces because it's 35 pages. We'll just read until a certain time. Just read until a certain time. What time shall we make that? Let's say between 11:05 and 11:10. All right, everybody. If you thought that was bad, this gets very personal and singular for a defendant, also known as Cassandra Ventura. I believe she was the woman in the video in the hotel that he was kicking around. Thank you for popping the trigger. So Cassandra Ventura versus Sean Combs and all of his shit. Even the complaint has a trigger warning to it. So just letting you know. If you can't be here, and that goes for both those of you that are watching and mods, if you have to back off, totally get it. Totally get it. Plaintiff Cassandra Ventura, Miss Ventura, hereby alleges as and for her complaint against defendant Sean Combs, Mr. Combs, Bad Boy Entertainment, Bad Boy Records, Epic Records, Combs Enterprises LLC, and Doe Corporations 1 through 10, together defendant corporations, and together with Mr. Combs, defendants, as follows. Here's the preliminary statement. 1. By the way, just the bravery that it takes to do this, especially against this person that had so much control, is just, I can't even fathom. Defendant Sean Combs is a rapper and record executive popularly known by his stage names Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, or Diddy. Apparently also PD and Love. I didn't know those. Mr. Combs came to fame in the early 1990s with his record label Bad Boy Records. He rose to prominence in the music and entertainment industry over the decades and is regularly referred to as a hip-hop mogul. 2. In 2022, Mr. Combs received a Lifetime Achievement Award at the BET Awards. During his acceptance speech, Mr. Combs stated, quote, "I have to give a special shout out, thank you, love to the people that was really there for me." He named a number of people before adding, quote, "and also Cassie for holding me down in the dark times. Love." The truth, however, is that Cassie, Miss Cassandra Ventura, was held down by Mr. Combs and endured over a decade of violent behavior and disturbed demands. For Miss Ventura, the dark times were those she spent trapped by Mr. Combs in a cycle of abuse, violence, and sex trafficking. Among other violent and unlawful acts, Mr. Combs raped Miss Ventura in her own home after she tried to leave him, often punched, beat, kicked, and stomped on Miss Ventura, resulting in bruises, burst lips, black eyes, and bleeding. Blew up a man's car after he learned that he was romantically interested in Miss Ventura. Forced Miss Ventura to engage in sex acts with male sex workers while masturbating and filming the encounters. Ran out of his apartment with a firearm in pursuit of a rival industry executive whom he learned was nearby. Demanded that Miss Ventura to carry his firearm in her purse just to make her uncomfortable and demonstrate how dangerous he is. And introduced Miss Ventura to a lifestyle of excessive alcohol and substance abuse and required her to procure illicit prescriptions to satisfy his own addictions. 4. Miss Ventura met with Mr. Combs in 2005 when she was 19 years old and he was 37 years old. He signed her to his label, Bad Boy Records, and within a few years lured Miss Ventura into an ostentatious, fast-paced, and drug-fueled lifestyle, and into a romantic relationship with him, her boss, one of the most powerful men in the entertainment industry, and a vicious, cruel, and controlling man nearly 2 decades her senior. 5. Mr. Combs asserted complete control over Miss Ventura's personal and professional life, thereby ensuring her inability to escape his hold. He provided unprecedented avenues for success for the aspiring artist, but in return demanded obedience, loyalty, and silence. 6. Throughout their relationship, Mr. Combs was prone to uncontrollable rage and frequently beat Miss Ventura savagely. These beatings were witnessed by Mr. Combs' staff and employees of Bad Boy Entertainment and Mr. Combs' related businesses, but no one dared to speak up against their frightening and ferocious boss. 7. Following these episodes of horrific abuse, Mr. Combs would immediately attempt to hide Miss Ventura and the evidence of his violent rage. He often showered her with gifts following incidents of physical violence, a typical pattern of behavior by serial abusers. 8. In addition to the physical assaults, Mr. Combs frequently reminded Miss Ventura of his ability to cause serious harm, whether by requiring her to carry his gun in her purse or by blowing up the car of a musician that was romantically interested in Miss Ventura. 9. Adding insult to injury, Mr. Combs used illegal substances and threats of violence to force Miss Ventura into repeated unwanted sexual encounters with male sex workers. 10. Over the years that Mr. Combs abused Miss Ventura physically and sexually, she again and again tried to escape his tight hold over her life. Every time she hid, Mr. Combs' vast network of corporations and affiliated entities found her. and those who worked for Mr. Combs's companies implored her to return to him. Many went as far as to explicitly state that her failure to return to Mr. Combs would hinder her success in the entertainment industry. 11. When she believed that she had finally separated from her longtime abuser, she joined Mr. Combs for a dinner, after which he forced her into her home and raped her while she repeatedly said no and tried to push him away. 12. Miss Ventura has now fully escaped Mr. Combs, but the harm that the assaults and sexual abuse he caused her to experience for nearly a decade will forever haunt her. She has required intensive medical and psychological care to recover from the trauma she lived through. 13. She cannot, however, continue to live in silence about what she endured. Mr. Combs remains immensely powerful and immensely dangerous. Miss Ventura therefore seeks justice for the decade of her life that Mr. Combs took away from her with threats of violence, excessive use of drugs, physical and psychological abuse, and sexual slavery. Accordingly, Miss Ventura brings this action seeking injunctive, declaratory, and monetary relief against defendants in violation of federal sex trafficking laws, the New York State Human Rights Law, New York City Human Rights Law, Gender Motivated Violence Act, New York Services for Victims of Human Trafficking, California Sexual Abuse and Cover-Up Accountability Act, and the California Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Jurisdiction and venue. This court has jurisdiction to 28 U.S.C. 1331 and 1343, as this action asserts violations of 18 U.S.C. 1591, and therefore raises federal questions regarding the deprivation of plaintiffs' rights. The court has supplemental jurisdiction over plaintiffs' related claims arising under state and city law. Pursuant, venue is proper in this court because a substantial part of the events or omissions given rise to this action, including the unlawful employment practices and intentional and negligent tort. Is that supposed to be tortuous? I think it's tortuous. I don't know that word. And it's going to bother me. Tortious. Constituting a tort or wrongful. Okay, wrongful. Cool. Negligent wrongful conduct alleged herein occurred in this district. Parties. Plaintiff Cassandra Ventura is a resident of the states of California and Connecticut and was employed by defendants Bad Boy Records LLC and Bad Boy Entertainment and related entities from 2006 to 2019. At all relevant times herein, Miss Ventura met the definition of an employee of defendants under all relevant statutes. Defendant Sean Combs, upon information and belief, resides within the state of California. At all relevant times herein, Mr. Combs met the definition of an employer of the plaintiff under all relevant statutes. Defendant Bad Boy Entertainment is a music, media, and entertainment company founded by defendant Sean Combs, which includes the record label defendant Bad Boy Records LLC. At all relevant times, defendant was an employer of plaintiff within the meaning of all applicable statutes. Defendant Bad Boy Records LLC is a Delaware limited liability company with principal place of business located in New York, New York. At all relevant times, defendant was an employer of plaintiff within the meaning of all applicable statutes. 21. Defendant Epic Records is a New York-based record label owned by Sony Music Entertainment, a subsidiary of Sony Corporation of America. At all relevant times, defendant was an employer of plaintiff within the meaning of all applicable statutes. 22. Defendant Combs Enterprises LLC is a New York limited liability company. At all relevant times, defendant was an employer of plaintiff. Defendant Doe Corporations 1 through 10 or corporations and entities affiliated with associations with defendants Sean Combs and the defendant corporations. At all relevant times, defendant Doe Corporations 1 through 10 were employers of the plaintiff. Factual allegations. 1. Teenaged Miss Ventura meets middle-aged Mr. Combs as her career begins. Miss Ventura met Mr. Combs in late 2005 or early 2006 after Mr. Combs heard Miss Ventura's first single playing in a club and expressed interest in signing her to his label, Bad Boy Records. At the time, Miss Ventura was 19 years old. Mr. Combs was 37 years old. Within months, in February 2006, Miss Ventura signed a 10-album deal with Mr. Combs' record label. That is an insanely long contract. Miss Ventura's first album, Cassie, was released in August of 2006, debuting at number 4 on the US Billboard 200. To promote the album, Miss Ventura made television appearances on MTV's Total Request Live, TLC, and BET's 106 & Park. Miss Ventura suffered from significant performance anxiety during these appearances, and press outlets were highly critical of Miss Ventura's performances on these shows. 29. Mr. Combs, however, sought to rehabilitate his newly signed talent, telling MTV News, quote, "You could hear the nervousness in her voice, and to be honest, I kind of smiled at it because it made me really appreciate what I really love about her. She's a regular person. It just made me appreciate that she got nervous, and it was kind of cute to me, to be honest. You've got to understand that success for her is coming out of nowhere. It's just so huge, and sometimes everybody handles it differently." While clearly paternalistic in noting that it was cute to him how regular Miss Ventura appeared, Mr. Combs' comments rang true to some extent. Upon signing with Bad Boy Records, Miss Ventura was quickly thrust into the spotlight and was unfamiliar with how to navigate her new celebrity status. Mr. Combs' recognition and glorification of Miss Ventura's naivete proved to set the groundwork for his manipulative and coercive romantic and sexual relationship with Miss Ventura, a woman nearly 2 decades his junior. Within a year of signing with Bad Boy Records, Mr. Combs became deeply entrenched in Miss Ventura's life, almost immediately asserting possession and control over her, and inserting himself into all aspects of her career and personal life. In November of 2006, Mr. Combs invited Miss Ventura to perform his song Come to Me along with him at the MTV Europe Music Awards in Copenhagen, Denmark. After a rehearsal for the performance, Mr. Combs walked around in a robe with a drink in his hand, flaunting his lavish party lifestyle to his label's newly signed artist. During hair and makeup leading up to the performance, Miss Ventura's hairstylist and Mr. Combs' makeup artist told Miss Ventura that Mr. Combs was, quote, interested in Miss Ventura. Miss Ventura shrugged off the gossip and in fact expressed disgust given the large age gap between her and the president of her record label. Emphasizing the age and power dynamic early on in their working relationship, Mr. Combs positioned himself as a father figure and protector of Miss Ventura. By way of example, after returning to New York after a trip to Las Vegas, during which she endured a brief hospital stay, Miss Ventura, who by then was fully healthy, went out to a club with her friends. When Mr. Combs saw her out, he reprimanded her, telling her to go home and take care of herself. At the time, Miss Ventura thought that her record label was looking out for her well-being, and that Mr. Combs had her best interests in mind. Mr. Combs also ensured he was intertwined with Miss Ventura's personal and social life. For instance, by inviting himself to Miss Ventura's 21st birthday party in Las Vegas. He also brought along famous musicians and producers, thereby flaunting his celebrity status and influence in front of a young and impressionable Miss Ventura. Although Mr. Combs knew that Miss Ventura was in a relationship at the time, and even though he was publicly in a relationship with Kim Porter, Mr. Combs nevertheless pursued Miss Ventura. At an after-party in a hotel suite following Miss Ventura's 21st birthday party, Mr. Combs pulled Miss Ventura into a bathroom and forcibly kissed her. Miss Ventura did not consent to this unwanted contact. She immediately ran out of the bathroom and the hotel suite and cried. She told her best friend at the time about what happened, but was too scared to tell anyone else. At the Video Music Awards the following day, Miss Ventura's boyfriend at the time joined her and Mr. Combs at the table at the award ceremony. Mr. Combs became angry, telling Miss Ventura that the invitation to the award ceremony was only for her and not for her significant other. 2. This will be the last section. Despite her clear rejection of Mr. Combs' advances, Mr. Combs continued to demand Miss Ventura spend time with him, including for a weekend at Mr. Combs' residence in Miami and for nights out in New York City. On one particular night, around September 2007, Mr. Combs insisted on taking Miss Ventura out. Miss Ventura acquiesced, fearing that rejecting Mr. Combs' request would have repercussions for her album deal with Mr. Combs and his company, Bad Boy Records. Mr. Combs picked up Miss Ventura from her apartment in Manhattan in a blue luxury vehicle. Miss Ventura was surprised. Miss Ventura, was surprised that when she got into the car, Mr. Combs was already inebriated. He handed her a pill and told her to take it. When Miss Ventura asked what the pill was, Mr. Combs dismissed her and told her she would like it. She later learned the pill was ecstasy, something Miss Ventura had never before tried and did not want to try. This was the first time Mr. Combs got Miss Ventura high. Mr. Combs then proceeded to drive recklessly at very high speeds down the West Side Highway of Manhattan. Miss Ventura was very scared, but did not dare to object to Mr. Combs, who appeared drunk, high, and agitated. Mr. Combs took Miss Ventura to an upscale lounge in downtown Manhattan, where he proceeded to get into an altercation with the security staff who would not permit Mr. Combs to enter, presumably because he was belligerent. Miss Ventura decided to go home, but for the remainder of the night, Mr. Combs messaged Miss Ventura incessantly, complaining that she left him high and alone. In early fall of 2007, Mr. Combs flexed his power and influence when he paid a promoter to create a fake flyer for a party hosted by Miss Ventura. This fake posting allowed Miss Ventura to have an excuse to go to Miami, Florida, and get away from her boyfriend by using the guise of a legitimate event she had to attend. Miss Ventura was stunned at how easily Mr. Combs was able to recruit others to lie for him. Miss Ventura was uncomfortable with the fake flyer, but because the request to go to Miami was made by the owner of her record label, and because she was scared to go against his wishes and face repercussions to her nascent career, Miss Ventura agreed to join Mr. Combs in Florida. During this trip to Miami, Mr. Combs provided Miss Ventura with copious amounts of drugs. She became more intoxicated than she ever had before, and her intoxication lasted throughout the weekend trip. As she wanted Mr. Combs to continue to support her career, she felt she could not refuse Mr. Combs urging her to take more drugs. After providing her with drugs, Mr. Combs had sexual intercourse with Miss Ventura during this trip. Within 2 years of meeting Mr. Combs, Miss Ventura found herself lured into the immediate circle of her boss, the owner of her record label, and one of the most powerful men in the entertainment industry. And that's where we're going to leave it for tonight. Whew. That's tough stuff, man. Just sucks. Like there shouldn't be like the ability to be wired to do that to another human being. At all. Just at all. I will never truly understand how somebody could do that. But next week, we are going to finish that up. And I think that there might be a couple of other documents as well. It's just like another 20 pages for that one. So it's a lot. It's a lot. And it's going to get worse. So we will be here next week at 9 o'clock. Feel free to like and subscribe and hit the bell so you know when we go live for the next one. To let you know, True Crime and Wine Time is tomorrow night at 9 p.m. We are putting Women on Death Row through a kind of a renewal. So it's going to be a little bit different. The same idea, the same cases, those kind of things. But we are going to be kind of producing it a little more. So thanks to Llama and whomever else we have help us out with that. So Friday, I believe, is going to be the death row at 7 p.m. Eastern, and then we're going to take a week off for that, and then we're going to come back to you again the following week, one time a week. Women on Death Row is not. It's a view. So it's on our channel. You can check out the playlists. Those have been added to the playlist, I believe. And then of course, there's more coming, y'all. There's so much more coming. Big announcement on October 1st and change. And just we're thinking of new stuff, new content every single day. We have a fantastic team of mods and our producer Tara and our APs Amy and Annie and our mods and lead mod Angie, and everybody is just wonderful and so supportive. And Lady and Gray's even moving into research and writing too. So there's a lot of good stuff, a lot of awesome stuff. Yay! So get ready. Anyways, thank you all so much for making it through that with me. That's a really difficult thing to do. And I will see you tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern. You all have a wonderful night. You take care of yourselves, your friends, your family, and your community. Don't let anybody ever dull that sparkle. And shine on, you crazy diamonds. Shine on. See you tomorrow night.